There is a moment, if you have ever stood on the western shore of Lake Tahoe on a still morning, when the water becomes something other than water. The surface goes so flat and so clear that the boundary between air and lake seems to dissolve, and you can see straight down through 40, 50, 60 feet of blue as if it were glass laid over the mountains. Tourists photograph it. They call it the most beautiful lake in America, and on that count they are not wrong. But clarity is a strange kind of gift. It shows you everything near the surface with perfect honesty, and in doing so it convinces you that you are seeing the whole truth. You are not. You are seeing the first 60 feet of a body of water that falls more than 1,600. And in the summer of 2024, for the first time in living memory, the lake did something no photograph had ever captured. It began to give things back. Think about what that means. A lake built, almost by accident, to hold its secrets in perfect cold and perfect dark for 70 years, and counting. And then a drought so severe it was called the worst in 12 centuries reached down, took hold of the shoreline, and pulled it back 9 full feet. 9 feet of water, gone. And along the edge, glistening in the thin mountain sun, lay decades of things that nobody was ever supposed to see again. Rusted metal, bottles fused with silt, the corroded skeletons of machines. But the shore, as it turned out, was only the warning. The shore was the polite version. What remotely operated cameras would eventually record 1,400, 1,500, 1,600 feet down, in water that has not seen sunlight since before those cameras' operators were born, is a different thing entirely. And some of that footage, according to the people who saw it first, has still not been released. To understand why, you have to understand the lake itself, because Lake Tahoe is not just deep. It is, in the most literal engineering sense, a vault. It sits at 6,225 feet of elevation, straddling the border between California and Nevada, cradled in a fault block basin that the Sierra Nevada shrugged open millions of years ago. It is the largest alpine lake in North America, 22 miles long, 12 wide, holding enough water to cover the entire state of California more than a foot deep. But length and width are the numbers that make postcards. Depth is the number that makes the story. Tahoe plunges 1,645 feet at its deepest point, which makes it the second deepest lake in the United States, behind only Crater Lake in Oregon. And down there, in that lowest cathedral of water, the temperature holds almost perfectly constant at around 42 degrees Fahrenheit year after year, decade after decade, indifferent to the seasons burning overhead. That cold is the first lock on the vault, the clarity is the second, and it works in a way most people never consider. Tahoe is famously, almost eerily clear because it is nearly sterile, starved of the nutrients that feed the algae and plankton that cloud ordinary lakes. That sterility is why you can read a newspaper through 30 feet of it. But here is the cruel irony the clarity conceals. The same emptiness that lets you see the surface so perfectly does nothing at all to reveal the bottom. Clarity is a surface virtue. Anything that drifts down past the reach of light might as well have fallen off the edge of the world. The lake shows you your reflection and hides everything beneath it, and for 70 years, that is exactly what it did. Now hold those two facts together, because their combination is the whole engine of what follows. Below 1,500 feet, 3 forces conspire. The cold, that stubborn 42 degrees, slows the chemistry of decay almost to a stop. The pressure, more than 45 times what you feel at the surface, presses down with such weight that gases stay pinned in solution, unable to bubble free and disperse the way they would in warmer, shallower water. And the darkness, total and permanent, shuts down the light-driven reactions that would otherwise break substances apart over time. Put those three together, and you do not have a lake bed in the ordinary sense. You have suspended animation. You have a place where whatever sank in 1955 is, in every way that matters, still there, still shaped like itself, still holding whatever it was carrying when it went down. Divers have a word for what the deep does to time. They say the cold keeps things. It is not a comforting word once you understand it fully, because it does not only keep steel and paint and glass, it keeps everything. So how does a lake become a vault in the first place? How does the most photographed alpine lake in North America end up holding decades of things its own communities would rather forget? For that, you have to go back to a time when Tahoe was not a destination at all, when it was, by the standards of the day, the middle of nowhere. Before the Second World War, Tahoe was remote in a way that is genuinely hard to imagine now. The roads that climbed into the Sierra were rough, seasonal, and often impassable, and the basin's beauty belonged mostly to the few who had the money and the patience to reach it. Then the war changed everything, as wars tend to do. The roads improved, because roads always improve when the military needs to move. Soldiers trained in the mountains, learned the country, and came home from the war with something they had never had before: money and a hunger to spend it somewhere that felt like the opposite of everything they had just survived. Somewhere clean, somewhere quiet, somewhere that looked like peace. They came, and the basin transformed almost overnight. On the Nevada side, where the state's laws permitted it, casinos threw open their doors, and with them came the neon, the traffic, the round-the-clock money that turns a quiet shore into an industry. Resorts went up, cabins multiplied along the water. What had been summer shacks became year-round homes, and what had been a handful of families became a boomtown wearing the costume of a wilderness retreat. It happened fast, faster than anyone planning it could keep pace with, faster than any law was written to control. And a boom like that, in a place like that, generates something that nobody puts on the postcard. It generates waste, enormous, relentless, inconvenient quantities of it. Construction debris, old appliances, broken machinery, cans and drums of the chemicals that built and cleaned and painted a lake town rising out of the pines. And in the 1950s, when all of that had to go somewhere, there was one obvious, bottomless, uncomplaining place to put it. The lake was right there. Think about what that phrase meant to a contractor in 1955, standing at the edge of a job site with a truckload of things he needed gone. There were no manifests to file. There was no hazardous waste hauler to call, because the very idea of hazardous waste as a regulated category barely existed yet. There were no fines, no inspectors, no paperwork trail waiting to trip a man up years later. There was only the problem in the back of the truck, and the solution shining a few hundred yards downhill, blue and enormous and apparently endless. You did not have to be a villain to make that choice. You only had to be busy and practical and living in a moment when nobody had yet decided the choice was wrong, so it went in. All of it, over years, in a slow, steady procession that no single person would have described as dumping because each individual act was too small to feel like a crime. A load of broken concrete off the back of a flatbed, a drum of solvent that had gone cloudy and useless, paint cans, their contents skinned over and hardened, the guts of a demolished cabin. And it did not stop at the small things. The people who worked the basin in those years talked, later quietly, about the cars, about the old vehicles that had reached the end of their lives and were worth more as a disappearing act than as scrap. You drove them out to a bluff where the shoreline dropped away steeply into deep water. You pointed them at the edge, and you let them go. Some were pushed. Some, if the stories are to be believed, were simply left in gear with a rock on the pedal and aimed at the horizon. And here is the detail that should stop you. Many of them went in with their tanks still full. Gasoline, oil, brake fluid, whatever was in them the day they died, all of it riding down into the cold with the steel. Now, every growing town in America was doing some version of this in the 1950s. Rivers took factory runoff. Bays took garbage barges. Vacant lots became informal dumps. What happened at Tahoe was not unique in its motive. It was unique in three specific ways, and those three things together are why this story is not just history. Why it is, instead, a problem that is still unfolding 1,600 feet down at this very moment. The first was scale. The boom was so fast and so concentrated that the volume of waste generated in a narrow window of years was staggering, and almost all of it funneled toward the same shoreline, the same handful of convenient bluffs, the same deep water drop-offs where the lake fell away fast enough to swallow anything. The second was depth. Most places you could dump into were shallow or moving or eventually dredged or dried up and got cleaned. Tahoe offered something almost no other accessible body of water in the country could: a floor so far down that no one would ever go looking, a place beyond the reach of curiosity itself. And the third, the one that turns an old dump into something closer to a time capsule, was the preserving chemistry we have already described: cold, still, dark. A near total absence of the biological and chemical machinery that everywhere else on Earth breaks the buried past back down into harmless dirt. So, while the rivers flushed themselves clean over decades and the vacant lots got paved into shopping centers, Tahoe simply held. It held the concrete and the cars and the full gas tanks and the cloudy drums exactly as they had been on the day they slid beneath the surface, and it went on holding them year after year, decade after decade, in a silence so complete that most people living on the shore had no idea any of it was there at all. Then something happened that always changes the story. The world began to care. By the 1960s and into the 1970s, a new consciousness was rising across the country. The first real environmental movement, born partly, it must be said, from places like this one. Tahoe became a kind of poster child for the cause, and for a reason that will feel familiar by now: its clarity. Because you could see so deeply into that water, any insult to its surface was immediately, undeniably visible. A slick of oil, a cloud of sediment where a bulldozer had scraped too close to the shore, algae blooming where none had bloomed before. The lake wore its wounds where everyone could see them, and so it became one of the most fiercely monitored, most passionately defended, most studied bodies of water on the continent. Researchers began tracking its famous clarity with instruments and dedication, watching it as you might watch the vital signs of a patient you loved. And the open, casual dumping, the flatbeds at the bluff, the cars off the cliff, largely stopped. Not everywhere, and not all at once, but the era when a man could push a sedan into the lake in broad daylight and think nothing of it came, at last, to an end. But here is the thing about that victory, and it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. All that attention, all that money, all that scientific devotion pointed in one direction, at the surface, at clarity. At the top 40, 60, 100 feet of water where people swam and boated and where the damage could be seen and measured and fought. Nobody turned that attention downward. Nobody surveyed the bottom, and the reasons were entirely reasonable, which is exactly why they held for so long. It was staggeringly expensive to explore water that deep. The technology to do it well was, for decades, simply not available to a research budget. And underneath the practical reasons lay a quieter, more human one, the kind of reason people do not put in grant applications. Nobody wanted to know. Because to go looking meant accepting the possibility of finding something, and a community whose entire economy, whose entire identity, was built on the image of an unspoiled jewel, had every incentive in the world to leave the bottom of that jewel unexamined. So the surface got cleaner and cleaner, brighter and clearer, more beloved every year, while 1,600 feet down, in the cold and the dark, the vault kept its contents exactly as they were, and waited. It waited through the 70s and the 80s. It waited through the boom in tourism and the building of new homes and the writing of the very laws meant to protect the water above it. It waited, in fact, until something no law and no committee could control came along and, without asking anyone's permission, began to pull the curtain back. The water started to drop. It started slowly, the way these things always do. A season with less snow than usual in the High Sierra. Then another. Then a third. Each one drier than the last, until the pattern stopped looking like weather and started looking like something more permanent. The scientists who study these things reached back through the tree rings and the sediment cores and the long memory of the land, and what they found was sobering. By their reckoning, this was the driest stretch the region had seen in something like 1,200 years, not the driest in a lifetime, not the driest since records began. the driest since before the first stones of the great medieval cathedrals were laid in Europe, before entire civilizations had risen and fallen on other continents, a drought measured not in years, but in centuries. And Lake Tahoe, that impossibly deep, impossibly ancient basin, began to shrink. Now you have to understand the scale of what that means. This is a lake that holds enough water to cover the entire state of California more than a foot deep. It does not respond quickly to anything. It is too vast, too heavy, too patient. For the lake to drop even a little, an almost unimaginable volume of water has to vanish, evaporated into the thin mountain air, drawn down through the single river that drains it, simply not replaced by the snow that no longer fell. And yet, season by season, it dropped, not inches, feet. By the deep summer of 2024, the surface had fallen roughly 9 feet below where it had been just a few years earlier. 9 feet on a lake that size is not a gentle thing. Think about what happens to a shoreline when the water pulls back by 9 vertical feet. On a steep bank, that might expose a strip a few yards wide, but Tahoe's edges are, in many places, long and shallow and gently sloped. And there, a 9-foot drop laid bare a band of lake bed that ran outward, not by yards, but by dozens of yards. In some coves, the new beach stretched 100 feet or more past where any living person had ever walked. Ground that had been underwater continuously for 70 years, 80 years, longer. Sunlight fell on mud that had known nothing but cold darkness since before the casinos opened, since before the highways were widened, since before the men with the flatbeds and the doomed sedans had done their quiet work and driven home. And the mud, it turned out, had been keeping things. The first people to notice were not scientists. They were hikers. Ordinary people out walking a shoreline they thought they knew, following the water's retreating edge out onto this strange new ground, and finding it littered. Tires first, the easy thing to recognize, half-buried, sun-cracked, some of them still on rusted rims that had not turned in 70 years. Then bottles, thousands of them, glass gone frosted and iridescent from decades of gentle abrasion, some still corked, some still holding a swallow of something no one would dare taste. Corroded metal in shapes that were hard to name, the skeleton of a stove maybe, or the frame of a bed, or the guts of some machine whose purpose had rusted away along with its label. It was, at first, almost a curiosity, a little grim, a little fascinating, the kind of thing you photograph and post and shake your head over. Look what people used to do. Look what was down there the whole time. But the finds kept coming, and they kept getting stranger, and the sheer quantity of it began to shift the mood from curiosity towards something colder. This was not the residue of a few careless picnickers. This was the accumulated waste of decades, an entire buried era of a town's history rising back into the light because the water that had swallowed it was, for the first time in living memory, letting go. And where hikers went, divers followed. Among them was a man named Colin West, who ran a non-profit built around a single, almost monastic obsession, cleaning the lake he loved, piece by piece, hand by hand. His organization had been at it for years already, working the shallows with wetsuits and mesh bags, hauling out trash the old-fashioned way. By the time the drought pulled the shoreline back, his teams had already removed something on the order of 20,000 pieces of debris from Tahoe's edges. 20,000. And still, they kept finding more, because every foot the water dropped exposed another apron of lake bed that no diver had been able to reach in a generation, ground that had been too deep, too cold, too far out to work, now suddenly wadeable, suddenly kneeling depth, suddenly giving up its contents to anyone willing to reach down into the silt. Through that summer of 2024, West and his people pushed farther out than they ever had before. And what they began to pull from that newly exposed, shallow ground was no longer just tires and bottles. It was bigger, it was heavier, it was, in the most literal sense, whole vehicles, and the condition those vehicles were in would be the first thing to make a hardened cleanup crew go quiet in the water and start asking questions they did not have answers for. The cars came from another century, dozens of them, scattered across the lake bed at depths that got greater the farther out the divers ventured. Rounded fenders and split windshields, running boards and chrome grills from the 1940s, 50s, 60s. Some sat upright as though they had been carefully parked. Others lay on their roofs, where they had turned end over end down a submerged slope. A few had clearly been driven straight off a ledge, tires still pointed forward, hoods still aimed at the black water they had plunged into decades before anyone in that car was born to remember it. And here is where the cold did its terrible, beautiful work, because these were not the rusted hulks you would picture, not the flaking, orange, half-dissolved wrecks you find in any warm water salvage. In that near-freezing, oxygen-starved dark, corrosion had nearly stopped. Paint still held its color. A dashboard's dials were still legible, needles still resting where they had fallen still. On one sedan, a 1957 model by the shape of its tail fins, a license plate was still readable, the numbers ghost pale but there. West would later describe the reflex that came over him at that car, the automatic involuntary act of peering through the fogged glass to check the seats, because some animal part of the brain, confronted with a preserved car in dark water, needs to know whether anyone is still sitting inside it. No one was. Not in that car. But the reflex tells you everything about what the lake had begun to feel like. It was no longer a curiosity. It was a place that held things it should not, in a state it should not, for longer than it should have been possible. That was the point where the work outgrew the divers. Human bodies have limits, and cold, dark, deep water enforces them without mercy. Below a few hundred feet, no wetsuit and no courage will keep a person alive, and Tahoe drops to more than 1,600. So the cleanup shared its findings with a research center at a nearby university, a team that had been quietly measuring the lake's famous clarity since the late 1960s, watching that number creep downward over the decades and wondering why. And that team brought the machines, remotely operated vehicles, tethered by cable, armored against pressure, hung with floodlights and cameras and sampling arms that could reach where no lung could follow. The first descents, from 200 down to 500 feet, showed only more of the same story told louder. More vehicles, more debris, the lake's hidden inventory extending far past anything the shore had suggested. But the ROVs kept going, and at 1,400 feet, the floodlights swept across something the divers had never seen and the researchers had never expected. Drums, industrial drums, cylindrical, dozens of them, scattered across the lake bed like a scattered pile of coins. And as the camera turned, it kept finding more, each one fading into the dark just at the edge of the light, the way objects do when there are far more of them than you can count. Not dozens, hundreds perhaps. And drums do not roll into a lake by accident. Drums that heavy, that far out, that deep, get there one way and one way only, because someone carried them out on the water and let them go, deliberately, in the deepest place they could find. Near 1,600 feet the barrels changed, bigger, heavier, and leaking. In that still, cold water, the plumes seeping from them did not disperse the way you would expect. They hung, suspended, held motionless in a place with no current and no warmth to stir them, faint clouds waiting in the dark. The sampling arms went to work, and when the results came back from the lab, they named the things that had been sitting in that water for the better part of a lifetime, lead at concentrations hundreds of times above any safe threshold, mercury, cadmium, arsenic, solvents that had been banned for decades, and the timeline the chemistry suggested pinned the heaviest of the dumping to the years between the late 1940s and the mid-60s, the exact window of the boom, the casinos, the money, the town rising faster than any rule could catch it. Worse still, the plumes were not staying put. Slowly, layer by layer, the contamination appeared to be migrating upward, toward the water people swim in, toward the water people drink. And then there was the part the footage does not show, the part that was reportedly pulled from public release, held back pending the involvement of investigators. Among the drums and the cars, the operators are said to have seen things that did not belong. Personal effects, and in more than one deep location, forms that no one on the team could bring themselves to describe as anything other than what they feared they were. The cold that had preserved the paint and the license plates does not discriminate. It preserves everything. And Tahoe, remember, was a town with a certain reputation in those boom years, a certain kind of money moving through its casinos, a certain old legend about people who went into the lake and never came back up. One operator reportedly said he has not slept right since that shift. The clothing, where it survived, suggested the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the same window, the same shadow. So now the lake sits at a crossroads with no clean way out. Raise the drums, and you risk tearing them open, releasing everything at once. Leave them, and they keep leaking, slow and certain, forever. Recover what may lie among them, and you reopen cold cases whose suspects and witnesses are all long dead. Do nothing, and the pristine image on every postcard keeps floating over a truth that is no longer possible to sink. So here is where I hand it to you. Of everything down there in that preserved dark, the forward-facing cars, the hundreds of leaking drums, or the forms the cameras turned away from, which single detail is the one you cannot stop thinking about? Tell me in the comments. And tell me honestly, if it were your lake, would you raise it or would you let it stay buried?